What's the difference between the Lord of the Rings setting and Forgotten Realms? Both have dragons, dungeons, wizards, monsters, and magic. So why do these settings feel so dissimilar? It's not that one is experienced as a book series or a movie trilogy, the only trilogy.
Cast it into the fire! Destroy it! No. Isildur!
And the other is a tabletop role playing game, but rather the answer lies in just how pervasive those wondrous concepts are in the settings. When your character walks into a city in the Forgotten Realms, one of the Dungeons and Dragons official settings, you will likely see wizard towers, alchemists peddling magical potions, or a forge that pumps out enchanted weapons and armor. In Middle-earth, those things exist, but they are greatly downplayed. Simply put, Forgotten Realms is a high fantasy setting, and Middle-earth is low fantasy. So why do we ask this question? Good question, theoretical listener! Crafting an adventure or campaign path can be extra tricky if you don't know what level of magic you want to have in it. We'll be talking about the merits of low versus high fantasy settings and how to build an adventure around them tonight on Playing God. I'm Nick Logie, and with me is Xander. We should take the unknown alien egg with us, Nolan.
Hey, man.
We're going to be blending low and high fantasy explanations together for the sake of side-by-side comparisons. So let's start by explaining what some high fantasy setting identifiers are.
Well, a high fantasy setting does not necessarily mean powerful magics. It means plentiful magics. Everybody and their mom can cast the prestidigitation cantrip at will, but a 7th level or an 8th level or even a 9th level spell are almost completely unheard of. They're things that just don't exist. And if they do, then very, very few people are even privy to the information, let alone know and understand how to do it. Where on the flip side, a low fantasy setting doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any powerful magic anywhere. It means that, let's say for example, a wizard casts a high level spell. That's an amazing feat, but that's the only wizard you've ever heard of in your entire life. You just don't know any other wizards, and nobody knows cantrips, and powerful magical artifacts are things that when you come across it, you're like, what the hell is this thing?
But yeah,
And
you
that's,
have in Middle-earth the One Ring. You
yeah,
have you have Sting, which has its own name. It's the only time you ever see something that acts like that in the I think the whole series.
mm-hmm.
Like those are just two magic items examples, which are kind of mundane items in like Forgotten Realms, because you could buy a ring of invisibility from
Yeah,
somewhere. It doesn't have all the extra plot stuff attached to it, sure, but the basic function can be the same.
yeah.
That the glowing thing with Sting, I think you could just put that on any weapon you want as long as you could find somebody to enchant it.
Yeah, like the thing that a good indicator of whether or not you're dealing with a high fantasy versus a low fantasy setting. If it's a low fantasy setting where magical items are very, very rare, these things are likely known to few, but those that do know it by a name. It has a name like Sting, for example, or the One Ring, or the Goblin Killer. Those things are very well known to those that understand and know about it, but are they're very special and they're very specific. You're probably only going to come across one, maybe two, in all of your adventures into this world. However, on the flip side, it's that sword has I think it glows whenever there's goblins around. That one's got a +1 to attack and damage, and this one's got a blah 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 blah. They're given statistics, not necessarily a specific name that identifies what it does, and that's a good indicator. So when you're a GM and you're doing these descriptions, if you're playing in a low fantasy setting where there's not going to be a lot of magical artifacts and things like that, take the time to give that artifact like a backstory and give it a name that some people will recognize it. The moment you pull it from its sheath and it's glowing blue and the orcs recognize it as, oh, that's Sting. We need to not fight that fucker. It makes that particular item a little bit more powerful, even if the effect isn't. But if you're in a high fantasy setting where things like that are just kind of thrown into the garbage when its charges are done because it's just not useful anymore, then you can go with the whole Don't worry about naming it. Don't worry about having specific things that are associated with it. Just it's a +1 short sword.
All
Nobody
right,
cares.
so you're kind of getting to too extreme with these examples. So even in like the Fifth Ed Dungeon Master's Guide, there are named magical items. This is a
Oh
perfect
yeah,
opportunity to bring out those legendary items that you're not going to see because you should base your entire campaign around them. Did someone find, I can't remember what it's called, but like the Talisman of Evil? That's what the whole level 12 campaign is. Like from first to 12, that's what you're going after.
yep,
Just like in Middle Earth, like the whole thing was about the ring for the whole time. Like there wasn't any other magic item that they were going after. It was just that one. That's how
yeah.
important it is. Now, just because a setting has powerful magic or like common magic, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is high or low fantasy. Because I noticed that you're still talking about like the certain power level aspects of it. But it's really about how frequent the average person in the setting will see it. Whether or not they know about it doesn't matter. So, like
Okay.
in Lord of the Rings, I think most people are aware that the Rings of Power exist. Nobody's going to find them, though, except if you're fated, or I guess the special instance in the One Ring is that it's trying to find its way back to Sauron or something like that.
Yeah.
But that by itself doesn't indicate lower high fantasy settings. So let's take a high fantasy example, which will combine kind of both, a little bit of both examples. So in the Forgotten Realms, or pretty much any generic D&D setting, you could think of something else if you don't want to think of Forgotten Realms specifically. Then if you go into some kind of magical academy, which is likely to exist. They absolutely won't exist, or if they did exist in a low fantasy setting, they're long since ancient and forgotten and destroyed or something like that. But it is likely that every single wizard you find there will be able to cast cantrips. That's fine. That by itself, without having any other qualifiers, would probably mean that this is a high fantasy setting. Because any wizard can learn cantrips. Now, any wizard can also make it to 20th level, theoretically, and gain access to 9th level spells. So, if this wizard learned 9th level spells, that doesn't change what kind of fantasy setting it is. It doesn't matter if you have a sorcerer who doesn't know any leveled spells, except I don't know if you could somehow break the mechanics like this, but until they reach level 6, they don't have access to magic. Like, they don't have level 5 or... Yeah, they don't like have level 5 to 1 spells. They have level 6 to 9 spells. I don't know why it would work that way, but that's just for the sake of the example. So, if they have access to this stuff, if it's something that every sorcerer has in your setting, then it's still a high fantasy setting. But if you have one sorcerer who could do this, and even if everybody in the world knows about this sorcerer, nobody in a low fantasy setting will ever have access to that kind of thing. This is why you don't see, as the characters just in a low fantasy setting progress, they don't get magic powers. Usually, sometimes they're supplemented with things, like maybe enchanted things, which even that, like, maybe you don't, like, straight up throw it away after you're done with it, or maybe items don't have as great of a narrative pull as they would in a low fantasy setting. But they can still be there. Not only can they still be there, they could still be a little plentiful depending on the specific situation. But if you're looking at the world from your average Joe farmer out in the middle of nowhere, or just on the outskirts of a city, they're never going to interact with this stuff. And if, for instance, like a band of trolls or something comes by and razes their entire town, then they're not going to have wizards and a magically equipped town guard to come save them. They might have a town guard to come save them, but every one of those people has to solve the problem mundanely. So when it comes to trolls, you got to kill them with fire. Nobody at any point will have access to magical fire to make the encounter, I guess, a little easier. When you down a troll, you would have somebody, maybe a party member, specifically set aside with a torch in hand with like an oil flask in the other to throw the oil flask at the troll after it's reached 0 HP and chuck the fire at it in order to do that fire damage to prevent the regeneration. In a high fantasy setting, this might be extremely easy for somebody to handle because you would have the captain of the town guard would know, like, prestidigitation, like as a requirement to join the force, to be able to light fires with a snap of his fingers. So when somebody chucks like dowsing oil or something else on these trolls, then it's as easy as this guy snaps his fingers. There goes one of the problems. Move on to the next troll.
Okay. So the differentiation between the two is its frequency, not necessarily the power level that is associated with it. Okay.
Yes. So in Middle Earth, like comparatively, the One Ring might not be that powerful in like D&D, but it is absurdly powerful in that setting. The entire plot revolves around it. Mm-hmm. But the entire plot wouldn't revolve around a ring of invisibility in like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign as the ring itself. Now, ring could be a qualifier for something or a MacGuffin, such as this ring of invisibility we need to track down because a politician is allegedly used it to assassinate a political rival, and the whole point of this is that the party needs to figure out who's telling the truth. Like, it could be a good plot hook still, but it's not going to revolve around it. You're not going to toss the ring at the end of this into the fire of Mount Doom because it is evil. It's just the ring is a tool that somebody used to do evil, but the ring inherently is not.
A good example of that one is actually when we, in Nick's campaign, were about to go and embark on a long and arduous journey into a desert that no one has ever escaped from and come back to tell the tale about. We had to quest for several game sessions to try and find an item known as a decanter of endless water that we could use to not, die of friggin' drought, and we had to have water that would be there and not carrying like buckets and stuff like that.
The encounter was thirst, and the CR was infinite.
CR was fuck this sucks. Because I remember when we went to the Plane of Fire, we brought along a large barrel.
Oh yeah, you stacked that barrel, and I felt really bad when you opened it up to get the water. I'm like, it's the Plane of Fire, so as soon as you start pouring it, the water evaporates and just joins the rest of the plane.
Oh, that would have sucked so bad. Because
you prepped so much for that, and I felt so bad saying that. But it had to happen.
Yeah, stay true to what's happening, I guess.
Well, I mean, stay true to the setting and how the planes worked.
Something that you can keep in mind as a GM when you're doing your descriptions for things. When you're dealing with a low fantasy setting, it is likely that your players are going to have to come up with mundane things to handle problems. And those particular descriptions are going to be fairly easy to understand and to convey back and forth across the table because they're things that would work theoretically within our real life. So, like what Nick was saying with the killing of the troll, you'd have one of the party members with a flask full of flammable oil and a torch, so that as soon as they knocked the troll down, dump the oil on it, and they
somebody different, because basically it would use object, throw a flask, and then some other player would use object, use torch against troll, and then that'd be what you do.
Yeah, they're easier to understand. However, don't let that deter you for a higher magic or a higher fantasy setting rather. Where the descriptions can be a little more ridiculous, and the craziness that your party comes up with. It's like, all right, I'm going to use 3 of my fireball spells, and let them go kind of nuts and go kind of wild, but don't let it be so important that it makes it sort of not a special, a non-special thing.
Oh, I get what you're saying. Determine how important the set piece is what Xander's saying. So, if it's in a low fantasy setting and you come into a room that has, like, floating magical circles and all sorts of other stuff going on, that's a huge deal, like in a low fantasy setting.
Yeah.
I don't care what the situation is. That by itself is a gigantic deal.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
shit floating is crazy.
Right, now if you flip that and you're in a high fantasy setting and you come into this, you're just like, God damn it, Bertram, would you clean up your fucking magical residue off the goddamn walls already? Like, this is the 3rd time this week.
That's just disgusting. Ugh.
It's like, how did you even make liquid light out of this, like, magical circle? Like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so it would be the difference between just kind of casual versus this is a big deal. So keep that in mind when you're GMing and kind
Right.
of
In
moving
addition
it
to that,
along.
don't put a lot of those set pieces into a low magic setting. That's the
Oh
other
yeah, no,
part
no,
that
no,
I
no.
forgot to mention about that I know Xander was getting to.
Yeah,
Which because then it does like mitigate how cool that is, like when your players see it. Because if they come into that room after like 4 levels of regular town spelunking or adventuring or whatever, and they come upon that, they know it's a big deal. In
oh
and out
yeah.
of play, it's a big deal.
Yeah, totally. Now, taking this kind of to the next extreme or the next level, rather. Speaking of levels, as your party, let's say you have planned for a 20 level campaign where your players are going to start and end. Start at first level and end around 20th. The things that they're going to interact with, even in a low fantasy setting, are going to be rather infrequent. So the items that they do possess, like the magical artifacts that have helped them become the great adventurers that they are, they're going to be known far and wide as the wielder of those things. But as they grow in power level, don't forget to kind of stay true to the low fantasy thing. And the reason why is you don't want to mitigate the fact that the beginning of the campaign was so gritty and kind of hard to deal with, and they had to deal with, smaller kind of issues in mundane factors where, now they're a higher level, say they have a wizard that can cast these high level spells and things like that. Try to give as much mundane issue that would seem like it's kind of a waste to use magic on, and let them sort of deal with it in mundane ways anyway, because that's what they're used to in the first place. Don't sort of go from low fantasy to high fantasy just because your party has gotten really powerful, and adversely so when you're dealing with a high fantasy setting.
You could actually that would be a perfect opportunity in a low fantasy setting when your players are higher level to like have like the stuff that at this point is really easy for them to do still be extremely impressive to anybody who comes across their path. So
Oh
like
yeah.
if you're I mean, if you have a bard like at all and they use any of their magical abilities, that in and of itself is amazing to probably anyone in the room.
Yeah.
So you could say like when your player's describing like them doing a performance on stage and integrating like their magical illusions and stuff like that. You could have the crowd like audibly gasp, or like maybe one guy who's superstitious of magic because he's only heard bad stories and never seen it his entire life just bails out of the room because he's afraid of it.
Starts
Maybe there's
freaking the
some
fuck
kind of
out.
Maybe there's some barbarian woman who's just like magic is evil and she sees this happen, so she draws her great axe and fucking charges the stage. Now you have a combat encounter.
I have a big problem with the big axe. On the flip side, when you're dealing with a high fantasy setting where magic is sort of commonplace and you can find people that are selling potions or they're selling knickknacks that have magical properties to them, remember that balance is indeed key. Just because there are people that are selling +1 great swords that are kind of hung up on the wall, don't go so crazy that there's like 50 or 60 of them kind of just hanging out around places.
Unless it really doesn't matter.
Unless it really doesn't matter. Yeah. So while most people would see it and they might come in contact with it relatively often, those things are still powerful. And where power is concerned, it takes a lot of resources to create these things. So the materials and the time that the wizard who created the thing, it's still going to be valuable. So don't underplay the value of some of these things just because they're rather commonplace. Not
Mm.
everybody has a magical artifact, but a lot of people have come in contact with people who do. But when the lady of the court comes in and she's sporting her ring that allows her to change the color of her gown on a whim, not everybody in the ball is going to have one, even though everybody knows that she can do this, and everybody's like, ugh.
Ah, that's a good point. I didn't think of that. In high fantasy settings, you could have like the ritzier people be like, "Look at this new thing I have. Look at my sports utility vehicle that just came off the rack that was invented next year."
Exactly. It's so like the difference between the way people react is in a low fantasy setting when she comes in with her ring and she does the change every single time it happens, it awes and woos into the crowd of
the
people.
fact that it is just magic is enough for it to be amazing.
Crazy. But on the flip side, in a high fantasy setting, you can have some of the other nobles like rolling their eyes like, ugh, just because she's the countess's daughter.
Yeah, exactly. Or you could have like an interaction with the common folk. It's just like, oh, you have last year's model of wand. I'm sorry to hear that.
That's so terrible for you. Think about it. If we were to kind of go
I like
into
to compare this with technology in real life, like today's technology, because you can make these same kind of comparisons where you consider technology as high fantasy, like first world stuff, and then like third world stuff being a low fantasy. I mean, I really don't want to compare it that directly because now we're talking about real people with real problems, and I don't want to like minimize that shit. But like here in America, it is very easy to come upon technology, whatever it is. It could be the computer that I'm using and sitting in front of right now to record this. It could be whatever device, cell phone, or other thing that you have that you are listening to this on, and that's very common for us. So, but if you took these same technologies out into rural China or somewhere else in the world that just doesn't see this kind of thing, just you having some weird glowy screen that does things when you push on it, that is an amazing thing in and of itself.
Yeah.
But if you compare it to the high fantasy example, such as if I am holding an iPhone 7, which I'm not because I don't do iPhones, but if I am holding an iPhone 7, that's an old-ass model of phone. It still works. It's still impressive. Like, the technology's amazing.
Yeah.
But we're at iPhone 11 now, and that's... Like, if you don't have an 11, man, then they look at you like, the fuck you still doing with this?
Yeah, and finding someone that doesn't have a cell phone is typically harder than you might think. And when people is like, hey, man, can I get your phone number? I don't have a phone. You kind of turn and
I
look
don't
at them
remember
like,
it.
Well, I don't remember. It's way common.
Yeah, because we have the amazing technology to tell us what our phone number is, and we don't have to memorize a bunch of strings of numbers anymore. But we did at one point.
Oh yeah, like I'm sure when I was a kid, I memorized every phone number that I had because cell phones just weren't a thing.
Man, I used to be able to rattle off fucking phone numbers. I don't know anybody's but mine now.
I just know mine as of now. But adversely, if you were to go to a place like Nick said, rural China, where they probably have TVs, but they're not going to have.
Let's assume we go to
screens.
a world. Let's assume we go to a country that doesn't have just doesn't even know what the concept of the internet is, or like has never seen a screen before in their entire lives. Like, you bring any bit of tech from the first world to that area, and it's like, holy fuck.
They're gonna freak
Who
the hell
are you?
out.
What god are you coming into this?
Yeah, and whether you want to believe it or not, there are places like that in our world that actually exist, and because that you can kind of take that sort of molding of how our world works versus the first world and then second and third world nations and things of that nature. You can even do that in your game. If you want to run a game where at lower levels they don't have access to magical artifacts and stuff like that. However, there is a nation to the south that does have magical artifacts, and in fact it's rumored that they have them aplenty, that everyone uses all kinds of amazing pieces of wondrous items and things like that on a regular basis, and it's just not important to them anymore. You could go there and you could find these things, and if you do, be prepared, because it's a system shock, and you could do that even with just your game.
Yeah, so let's take a look at this from not a strict level 1 to 20 set. So when you are deciding initially on whether or not you want to use low or high fantasy, consider the end level result of your players. If you or even if you want to specifically set out to do a low or high fantasy setting, then you can also consider what your players should be at. As opposed to basing the game around the players. You could do it the other way around.
Yeah.
So if you're like, I want a low fantasy setting, what's the best level to have that? It's like, have the range for that be like level 1 to 8. When they hit level 8, that's where the campaign ends. Like, not as a hard stop or anything, but like
Yeah.
this is where narratively you're kind of like you finish the conflict, you're going into the resolution, and you're leading them out the door, maybe to starting another campaign with new characters. High fantasy, you could take it 120, or you could start higher, 10 to 20, or
Oh
10 to
yeah.
18, something like that. Sky's the fucking limit. Well, 20's the limit, really.
Yeah, kind of. Alternatively, thinking about how to deal with your game, sit down with yourself and sit down with your players. I believe we've covered this at one point in time in player and DM
It's probably like
expectations.
setting up the friggin' game or something
When
like
you're
that.
setting up your campaign, know what you want to have initially. Like, I want to have a low fantasy setting, and then tailor all of your adventures to kind of fit into that. Don't kind of deviate,
Absolutely.
because consistency is key. And the same thing with a high fantasy setting. You don't want to downplay the high fantasy aspects, because halfway through the campaign you think, ugh, I kind of wish I'd have done low fantasy. Kind of just stick with it.
Yeah, you can introduce certain elements of that into the
Yeah.
game, but don't change the focal point.
Yeah, the focal point should be uh, set when you start your campaign, and when you write your world, and when you write the campaign's adventures and things like that. Keep that kind of in the back of your mind.
So part of the reason you want to present this and know what you're going to do before you start a game is because this also informs the players on what kind of characters they can make. Because if you have a low fantasy setting and you decide there aren't going to be any magical character classes, that changes what everybody's going to do. Because maybe one of your players came to the table hoping to play a warlock. But if there's no magic in your setting, then they can't play a warlock because either their shit doesn't work, in which case they've just wasted their levels, or it works, and then you got to explain why it works. Now, if part of that character arc is you want to explain why it works, then yeah, go ahead. But if you want to decide this stuff before anybody makes characters, because if you do want to set restrictions like that, like maybe we're never going to get past 8th level, so if you want to play a caster class, don't ever expect to cast like 5th level spells.
Yeah.
Because then people will decide, what caster class do I want to play that is conducive to level 1 to 8?
Or they could, in theory, also do multi-classing with a couple of different casters, so that they can broaden their horizons where the casting is concerned, rather than just kind of sticking with it to try and get a higher level, because they know they're not going to get there.
Or you,
Alternatively,
or if somebody does want to multi-class multiple casters, you may say no to that because there's
Oh,
no
yeah.
way to gain access to that information. Do you want to multi-class as a wizard? What spellbook are you going to find to teach you that? There's no classes on that. You can't go out into the fucking city and like get an education. You're not gonna find random stuff around that tells you how to do it. Like, you're gonna have to guess.
Yep.
And if you guess, you're probably gonna blow your ass up.
and you're probably going to get it super duper wrong. Alternatively, if one of your players is just dead set, like, please let me play a caster level, play a caster, even if you're like, you know what, okay, I'll let one player play a caster, but here's the thing: nobody sees magic in a positive light. So you're going to have to do all of your stuff on the sly, kind of sneaky. And if you get caught by anybody that's important, you might not just go to the dungeons, you might go to the chopping block.
Well,
And that'll
that's a
create...
pretty common setting stipulation. That's
Yeah.
why you don't. That's why when you play Psychers in Dark Heresy, you don't actually want to play Psychers in Dark Heresy.
Yeah, they're really powerful. They're really fun to play, and it adds a dynamic that, while it's been done quite a few times, there's a reason why it's been done quite a few times. It's kind of fucking fun. So you
I
can
mean,
totally
it is,
have a
yeah.
low magic thing and have a caster, maybe two, where everybody else is just mundane people, and you can kind of tailor the adventure to be sort of like that. But
That is more
it depends on what
specifically
you
what
want.
you're trying to get out of an adventure. Because, I just thought of this. Similarly, you could flip that on its head and be like, everybody in this city is required to have some kind of magical level in something. So if you're fighter level 19, you have to have one level in druid or some shit like that. I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
you could have the guy who doesn't know how to cast magic be a guy who's just like, I can totally bluff my way through all these magical checks that I need to make by doing like regular real life mundane magic to try to trick people into thinking he's doing real magic.
Like, he's studied, instead of studying magic, he studied chemistry, and now he can mix two chemicals together to make shit glow. It's like, holy shit, what
This
spell
is
is that?
This
like-
is a secret spell that I developed.
This is something that I developed myself.
Ah,
Oh,
and a
that's really
magician never
cool.
reveals his secrets.
Of course
Shifty
not.
eyes. His secrets are that he doesn't actually know magic. But yeah, you
That's
can
actually
flip that
really
on its
fun.
head. It's basically just whatever you want to do at that point. We're just giving you some broad strokes things for high and low fantasy shit.
Hmm.
When you're trying to integrate this stuff into like your descriptions, what you're gonna want to do is you're gonna, depending on which, no matter which side you go with, you're going to want to make sure that your background descriptions reflect that. So when you are, say, in a town, in a low fantasy setting, what you will do is you will likely describe somebody in the background, just some random NPC. Sometimes people refer to them as gray blob NPCs.
That
Basically,
would be
this
me.
person. Yeah, okay, so gray blob NPCs. This person would be like something very small that you could just describe on their way to the tavern. So, like, as you're walking down a cobblestone road with an overcast sky, to your left there is a farmer who has just finished up his shop at market. He's throwing like this satchel over his shoulder to carry it over to his cart where his horse is attached to it. He throws it on there. He wipes some sweat from his brow, and then they ride off. That would be a low fantasy description. Let's take that exact same thing and throw it into high fantasy. So as you're walking down a cobblestone road, following the waypoint signals from the hovering crystals that line the street, you cross a farmer who has just finished his trip to market. As he carefully lays down the box of glowing vials and and possibly like magic emitting seeds, he gets on his wagon, which does not have a horse attached to it, and it rides away by itself. Now, that's a background description because if we saw that in real life, we'd probably be like, well, no, hold on, what the fuck? How's he riding a wagon with no horse? But think about that for a second because it's the same thing people asked when cars were invented. Because it was like,
Yeah.
how the fuck
Where's
are
the
you driving
horse?
that thing? Where's the horse? I don't get it. But if it's in a high fantasy setting, it's like, okay, he just got in his car and left. Like gave it more fantastical description because it's a fantasy game, but ultimately he just hopped in his car and drove off. That's
Yeah.
all you really got out of the scene. Now, you put that in to establish the flavor and the setting a little better for the players. It keeps them immersed, which is
Oh
something that
yeah.
I definitely try to do in all my games. And it throws extra detail in that isn't intrinsic to the plot. So something that this is kind of something I see with new DMs especially, but I'm going to throw this in here, and it's making everything focused on the players. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait, isn't that a good thing? And yeah, you're right.
Yeah, you're right.
But you don't always want to focus on the players because things happen in the world regardless of whether the players interact with it or not. So this random farmer guy that I have driving away, like, he's not important to the plot. He's not going to get a name. He's never going to be seen again for all I care. But since I described him, the players are obviously going to
They're
chase
gonna
him
go
down and
talk
talk
to
to him
him.
for 13 hours.
What's inside your
But
boxes?
yeah, for real. It's like, what's the glowing yellow one mean? It's like, I don't care. It's just a variety of colors I came up with for the description. So let's assume that they just go to the fucking tavern instead. They're never going to see this guy again. But the description is still important because they have a better understanding of what they're visualizing when they're imagining a scene. If you're
Hmm.
imagining a low fantasy tavern, you're only imagining something with like just in a dimly lit place with wood tables and shit like that. But a high fantasy tavern, it could be fucking insanity. It could be like you walk in and there's a bunch of circular tables bolted to the ground, and you're like, huh, that's a bit weird. You see everybody seated at these tables, a variety of wizards and sorcerers. At one point, a guy uncorks his wine bottle and then holds it up in the air, and after he like elevates his arm, the wine pours upwards, and that's when you look up and see that there's actually another tavern on the ceiling, except it's in reverse. So gravity is actually holding them up there and holding everybody else down. So when you take the staircase on the side of the tavern that looks twisted and weird, it's because after you cross the threshold of that staircase, your gravity flips and you are on the top section of the tavern now.
That is possibly one of the coolest things I've ever heard somebody come up with, and I think I'm gonna steal that, Nick. I'm
Okay,
totally
fine.
gonna
Well,
steal the shit
I
out of
made
that.
that up as I was coming up with the examples, so go ahead.
That's awesome. Another thing that uh, you'll find with newer players, because they're newer GMs rather, because they're so focused on like making sure that the players are da da da. One of the things that we've covered in previous episodes are what are your bad guys doing? What are they doing out in the ether while your players are accomplishing their goals? Because your bad guys and your NPCs are doing their own kinds of things. And when you tailor to create the things that they're doing and you're thinking from their perspective, you kind of look at it from in a low fantasy setting. They have been questing for the past 20 years to find this one artifact, and this one artifact is the thing that's going to give them just a little bit of an edge. And they've been hunting for it for a long time.
They there's
finally
a fucking
found
dagger
it.
of troll killing that they could totally use instead of having all those guys fucking hucking oil and shit at them.
Yeah, like that's just the thing, and that's the thing that your bad guys are doing. They're likely going to be machinations and things that are kind of involving your plot and your setting that are more mundane in nature. So you're not going to come across a 20th level lich that's just got a giant castle that every room is magical and each one has a different aspect to it in a low fantasy setting. Unless that's the big end thing.
Exactly. Or if you do, it is the only one.
Yeah,
There's nothing
that's
else in the world that reflects this.
And that's the reason why it's such a big problem. But most of your lieutenants and the underlings for your big bad, they're going to be doing mundane things. You know, they're going to be undermining local governments. They're going to be raising an army of trolls to try and fight against this army of humans that's been coming through.
I was trying to figure out where you're going with this. Is this like they have to solve things mundanely like the players do?
They absolutely do. Versus a high fantasy setting where they can use magic for every goddamn thing because they're really powerful.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, using the same Lich example, instead you could be like playing the bad guys or something, and then be like, yo, dude, we know that Lich back on the east coast of the continent, right? Well, we need like 1,000 skeleton soldiers. Can we go like pay him for it or some shit like that? And then everybody in the party is like, yeah, sure, let's do it.
Yeah,
and
sure,
then you
let's do
quest
that.
over there, and he's like, are you guys for real? You guys keep coming to me. I'm the only Lich in the world, and you keep trying to get my shit from me. Well, you know what? You get to go through the dungeon like everybody else. And
and they just kind of roll their eyes like, ugh, really? God damn it.
I don't want to solve your magical castle for the fucking 20th time, Dracula.
Dude. So, how your big bad guys and even your smaller kind of local villains handle things are in either very low magical means or no magic at all. And that kind of illustrates that when you do come across magic, even from your bad guys, it's got to be a big deal. It can't just be like, when you find the sword of goblin slaying, there's only one. It is known as Berchlorfith, or whatever the fuck it's been called. Berchlorfith. But it's like, oh, that's another goblin slaying sword. I got like 5 of them stuffed in my bag. You don't want to kind of go nuts with it. You want to be like, oh, that's a sword of goblin killing. Huh. I saw one of those. A guard had it in a couple of towns back. And they're pretty good, but they're just like every other sword, except for when you're fighting goblins. So, I mean, if you're gonna fight goblins a lot, that's a good sword to have. Otherwise, just get a regular short sword, dude. That kind of deals with it in different ways.
So this is where things kind of get a little weird, because when you have a low fantasy setting and a high fantasy setting, the one you pick kind of, to some degree, limits your imagination. And surprisingly, the one that limits your imagination is the low fantasy settings, because you have to be more grounded and more down to earth with how things are solved. With high fantasy, you could just bullshit and it doesn't matter because it's magic and I ain't gotta explain shit. Like, if you walk into like these rooms with all the floating shit and all that, you don't have to go into all the details on that in a high fantasy setting because it's expected. But if you have any of that in a low fantasy setting, you now have to explain where all that's coming from. Because if your players come across that and they have or can somehow use to some degree detect magic, then you gotta be able to explain the school of magic. You gotta be able to explain like who cast it, how it's there, why it's perpetuated, etc., etc. And That's really so. If you want to kind of like more limit what your players and you imagine, go with the low fantasy setting. And if you want to like go fucking nuts like I usually do and just put in whatever you want and just figure out how to fit it in afterwards, then high fantasy is probably for you. Low and high magic are really at the ends of the spectrum, since you can put in as many or as few themes as you want. Sprinkling in some of either can bring surprise and flavor to your campaign setting. You can even have a no magic setting if you want to prevent your players from accessing 80% of the character options, but that's up to you. Thank you for listening. If you like our shit, give a like or share a comment. Better yet, share the links. Don't forget to subscribe for whatever nonsense we come up with, and we'll see you next time on Playing God.
Later, man.